I'm a writer and translator. My first novel was this one, The Book of Losman. It came out in October of 2024. And I'm excited to present, to be here for this panel today. What to expect when you're expecting a debut novel. Very clever title. What we're going to do here is I'm going to try to break this down into 3 sections of questions, and then leave time for the end at the Q&A if you guys have questions. What we're trying to do is go through the process that a writer goes through when they are, they have a debut novel coming out. So what we're going to do here in this first section is I'm going to pass along to each of our panelists here. They're going to introduce themselves and read the first paragraph of their book. So we're going to start at the end with Jennifer Savran Kelly.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Savran Kelly. I feel like I've done a bunch of events around town and I don't recognize a lot of you, so I'm glad you're here. I am a writer, mostly fiction, and my debut novel, Endpapers, came out in February of 2023. And so I'll just read you the first paragraph, and the very quick summary is that a genderqueer book conservator finds a mysterious old love letter, setting off a search for the author who wrote it and for a meaningful life beyond the binary in early 2000s New York City. Can you all hear me? Okay, I have some allergies or something, so I'm...
Should we be using the mic?
Yeah, I just didn't want to is it on?
I have no idea.
Okay, how is that? Is that better?
Better.
Okay, great. So the first paragraph of Endpapers. Because I'm not ready to go home to Lucas. Because lately I get more pleasure from spreading open the covers of a book than my own legs. Because the pungent smell of ink and the soft touch of paper. I linger here, in the book conservation lab, after hours, after everyone has gone off to rejoin loved ones, even our boss, who usually stays because she has a project on the side. That's the first paragraph.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out on this miserable rainy day. I'm Aggeliki Pelikidis, and my debut novel, Unlucky Mel, was published in September of 2024. Unlucky Mel is the story of a graduate student who is betrayed by her best friend and vows to take revenge. And it's a comedy. I know it doesn't sound like one, but it's a comedy. All right, so I'm going to read the first paragraph, if I can find it. Here we go. Despite its being well before 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, parking lot M at Vestal University is full. Melody Hollings drives up and down the rows, unwilling to venture into lot N, which is farther away from the classroom she teaches in 3 days a week. Finally, she wedges her old brown Sentra in next to a new silver BMW that straddles the yellow line between the spaces. Resisting an urge to smash her door into the nicer car, which has a VU student parking tag on its back window, Mel opens it the width of a cantaloupe and slides out sideways, dragging her messenger bag behind her. She looks around to see if she's alone, then reaches into her bag for a Post-it notepad and pen. She scribbles, "Park within the lines," and walks around to the driver's side to stick the tiny sheet onto the rearview mirror of the BMW, before glancing around again to check and see if anyone has seen her.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming out. My name is Roohi Choudhry. I live in Brooklyn, New York, just got here, and I'm really glad to be here. My first book is called Outside Women, and it just came out 6 weeks ago, so it's still a newborn. And it is the story of 2 women separated across time and space. It's mostly set in South Africa, where I'm from, and they both have the same decision to make, which is whether to risk their own lives to save somebody else. So I'll read the first paragraph. I should board the train home, but it runs above ground, so the city will dance far below me as I ride past. When I tap my head against the window, I'll watch blurred movement through glass. I prefer to wait until dark, when my own reflection is all that stares back. For now, I'll walk along the East River and imagine I'm part of the city, like a grain of sand seen from above. Here's a couple on their first date. Carefully unsaid words rest between them on the bench. A woman pulls up the zipper to her daughter's bright pink jacket and pats her chest safe. An old man feeds gulls from a plastic bag pocked with reuse. His stale bread spins like a cricket ball across the water.
Getting tricky.
Yeah. I'm gonna turn it off and we can thread it through. Here, there we go.
Thank you.
Is that helpful?
It is helpful.
Okay, there.
Hi, and I'm also going to read a little bit from mine. And the Book of Losman is about a literary translator in Copenhagen, Denmark, an American literary translator with Tourette syndrome. And he gets involved in a dubious drug trial to find a cure, which, of course, there is not one. So this is the opening paragraph of mine. When he moved to Copenhagen with his Danish girlfriend, Kat, 15 years ago, Losman imagined his life like a photo's guidebook, rich with possibility and adventure. But it didn't turn out that way, because no life ever did. And now that Kat had left him, he lived alone, except on the weekends his son, Axel, visited. Losman was a literary translator. On an average day, he woke up, made coffee, and got to work filling Word documents with letters. 10 pages a day, that was his goal. On this particular day, he would discover a dead man, punch a swan to save a little girl, and find an experimental memory study that would alter his life and possibly his brain chemistry forever. Not an average day at all, but at this moment, all that was in the near future. Now, in the present, he sat at his desk, gaping at his fuzzy computer screen, having made it through 6 tedious pages of translation when he was startled by a knock at his door. So one of the reasons I asked the panelists here to read the first paragraph from their books was A, to get a sense of the flavor of their story, since this isn't a full-out reading tonight. But the other reason is more nuts and bolts, and that is essentially when you write any piece of anything, really, you have to go through a lot of revisions and the process of that. So I wanted to ask each panelist here today what it was like during the revision process and how they got to that opening sequence of their book. We'll just go down the line.
Okay. So this part of the book was probably the last thing I wrote. And I think that's not uncommon, that the beginning is the very last thing that gets, rewritten a million times. And I used to actually have a prologue that began the book, and I think everybody who read it said that it was not a good idea to have a prologue, but I was so, determined to keep it. And then by the end, I could finally see what they saw, and it felt like that this would be a more dynamic beginning, to have this moment when things change for this main character, rather than a prologue, which felt like kind of pulling back, big picture, and it was slower.
So with my book, this actually was not the beginning. This actually was, I believe, chapter 2. So backstory, Jennifer was my editor at Cornell University Press, which published my book. So she is the person who had me do a lot of revisions, but all to good effect. Like, I have no regrets over any of the revisions. But just really quickly, the cliche, you have to be willing to murder your darlings. There was a lot of murdering that was happening during my draft process, a lot of murdering. And there were times where I was like, God damn it, not again. But it all turned out to good effect. If you are fortunate enough to get an editor who has your book's vision in mind and your best interest in mind, trust them and go with what they say, because you'll be happy with the end results.
She has to say that because I'm sitting right here. No, I love this book from the minute I read it, and I did want to help Aggeliki get to the best possible version of the book. That being said, I also had an editor who asked me to write a new chapter 1 for my book, and so this whole opening that I read to you, because I'm not ready to go home, because lately I get more pleasure from this, because the pungent smell, a lot of because. Originally, that was because the very first chapter was my main character, Dawn, finding the letter inside the book that was going to set off the entire chain of events of the novel. And I was trying to establish a sort of chain of events here. Like, it was coincidence, but it was also because she wasn't ready to go home, because she was getting so much pleasure from books, because of the sensory input she was getting, she lingered, and then she ended up finding this letter. But I think over time, I sort of forgot that. And I kind of liked the cadence of it, and people kept saying it's a really nice opening, but my editor really wanted a different chapter. So I left that as the opening, but the reason for it changed over time, which is very interesting, to the point where I had sort of forgotten my own intention for starting the book that way.
I'll give mine briefly before we go on to the next question. I'm a translator as well, and I translate from Danish. And I translated a small collection of stories by an author named Semmel. And I've always been captivated by his work. He's the most non-commercial writer I've translated. Very David Markston-esque in a certain way. But one of his stories from his first collection, which is probably his most normal work, and that it's kind of like Carver / Hemingway. He was learning and he was writing, and so these original stories. But there's one story in there that was so captivating for me that I decided that I wanted to write my version of it. And so the opening chapter is a retelling of that entire story. And so we meet characters who are in Simon's story, but we meet him in mine. And then I've inserted a narrator, the character Losman, in there to kind of interact with the two characters from Simon's story. And that's where that came about. And when I realized at the end of the process of writing the draft that I was writing a circular narrative, that I wanted to write that circular narrative, I went back to the beginning and I put in kind of like what you said, and I put in things there that kind of led to the circularity, to give clues back to that circularity. So that's how it came from for me. Going back to the writing process here, one of the chief things that all writers have to deal with and learn to deal with is rejection and failure. So I wanted to ask each of you, what are some of those moments? What is the lowest point of your writing, and how you overcame that?
It's just a cheerful Friday evening here.
It's a perfect day for this question.
It's kind of a gothy
Perfect
night.
time in our nation's history.
Yeah. There were a lot of low points. So I'm trying to think of one of the lowest was probably, I think maybe 5 or so months into my agent sending this book out and just deluged with rejections. And, there were still quite a while longer to go. I didn't know that then, but I think there was one that really got to me. And because it got really close, and that's actually the worst, is when it gets close. And at that point, I was at such a low point that I couldn't even read, which felt like the worst loss of all, which I think people who are coming out for a book event can sympathize with. It's like losing your best friend. So I was like, this is not okay. I don't want to lose my love of reading. And so I felt like I had to take, some drastic measures and really look at myself and why this external process was such a big, identity crisis. And I felt like I realized through that, and part of that was by writing an essay about what I was going through. So rather than, I was already journaling and things like that, but writing an essay to me is a different process because there's a sense of, there's a sense making and asking questions and figuring out what your questions are. And that kind of helped me because I realized that the thing that was harming me about this rejection process was actually the thing that I had absorbed and internalized and said to other people too, like, this is what you need to sell stuff, you need to, get this validation, and that needed to be changed in my mind, So that was a longer process, but just beginning to understand that question was like really helpful and I think was really necessary.
Okay, so this book is born of failure, like a massive failure. So I went to get my master's degree and my PhD in English literature with a creative writing emphasis. I'm getting stories published. I think I'm hot shit. I write a novel and I'm like, oh, this is it. This is the one that's gonna get me an agent. I'm on it now, right? No, it did not. Nobody wanted it. They disliked it. No narrative arc. We like your characters. Your writing's pretty good, but no narrative arc. So what that told me was I had no clue about plot. I went through my entire graduate school education and didn't learn a damn thing about plotting. Now, plotting, we sometimes think of that being for genre fiction, but no, not really, right? Other books, literary fiction should have, or could have, whatever you want to do, a plot. So when I failed dismally over and over again, my husband will tell you, he doesn't know how I got through so much rejection because it is brutal out there. I was like, I can either progress doing the same thing, which is, of course, another cliche, I'm full of them today, the definition of insanity. Or I can say, I need to learn. I need to do something completely different. I need to find books on plotting and understand how a good plot that has a trajectory based upon who the character is actually works. And from that, I learned how to outline. I used to be just what they call a pantser, where you just kind of write. And, well, that's not for me anymore because it did not pan out for me. And so I outlined this whole book before I wrote it. I just said I'm going to do things completely differently than how I did my first novel and see if that turns out a different result, and it did. So failure actually taught me two really important things. One, how to plot, sort of, I still am learning. And two, that you can learn from failure. Like failure is a great teacher if you're open to that. And so that's my lesson on failure.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of my lowest moments of failure was after my book came out, which is something that I think people don't hear very much and don't talk about very much. Before it came out, before I got an agent, I had an agent ask me to revise and resubmit in 3 months. And we had a phone call and we had a really great conversation. I spent 3 months working my butt off to revise the novel, and then she rejected it. 4 more agents ended up, or maybe 3, asking me to revise and resubmit, or telling me I could revise and resubmit. They all had different feedback. I was losing my mind, but what I had to do was regroup and say, okay, this is my second novel. My first novel never got an agent interested even to that degree. I was like, clearly there's interest here. There may not be agreement about what I should do with this book, but clearly there's enough interest that I'm onto something and I should keep going. After the book came out, the industry is rough, right? And so my agent had retired from agenting. My editor had left Algonquin. I was with a new editor that I had never met, that I didn't know. She rejected my next book. Things got really tough after my book came out. So instead of really enjoying the process, I sort of got mired in this whole, like, wow, now I'm getting a lot of rejection all of a sudden while I'm supposed to be celebrating that my novel just came out. And essentially what I do for myself and what I try to tell other writers is that as you write, right, if you're a writer and you want to publish in any way, shape, or form, or even if you don't, you may have goals for yourself. That goalpost will constantly be moving. In the beginning for me, it was, I just want to write a successful story. I want to get feedback from a writer that, I think does a good job and feel like I've written something successful. And then I'd really like to publish a story in a literary magazine, even just like a small regional one. And then it's like, oh, what if I got published in a slightly bigger journal? What if I got into this conference I really want to go to? What if I wrote a novel? What if I got an agent, right? So the idea being that success kept changing for me. And the definition is always somewhere out there. And what I realized was I need to look back more often. I need to look back at that person who was just starting out, who was so scared, and sort of not make a list of what my goals are, but make a list of what I've already accomplished. Because that, like the me that started out, 15 years ago, whenever it was, would never have imagined I would have gotten as far as I have, right? And I'm sure the same is true for every single person who's ever written a word. Looking back is really helpful, and just having good community around you, believing in yourself, having good community of other writers that you can talk to about this, because the road to success is paved with rejection. It will never stop, not after you publish your first novel. So good to get used to it, have some strategies.
I'm not sure I can follow any of those. That's actually very excellent advice and good information. I'm going to say mine very briefly, and that is, I had an agent, and I have written over the years. I've written multiple manuscripts. Most of the time, I just put them away and never do anything, because I have this internal belief that I'm a terrible writer and that I actually can't write at all. And this is especially was so 10, 15 years ago, and it was just bad. But I did end up getting, after 10 years, I wrote a novel for 10 years. It took me that long, like 17 discrete drafts, and I got an agent. And I thought, I'm ready, I'm going now. And he shopped around to a number of places, and I got a lot of wonderful rejections, to the point where it almost felt kind of nice. You know, it's like, wow, this person at Penguin Random House thinks I'm a good writer. But then they rejected it. And so after a while, all those kind of nice rejections start to weigh you down. It's like, it's not going to happen. And one time, this was probably the worst of it. This is what I'm going to say. There was one press, and I can't remember what it was anymore off the top of my head, but it was a good one. And my agent on a Friday said, they like it. The editor wants it. And this was a retelling of Beowulf, right? So this is like this kind of non-commercial thing. And then the agent then added, but wait, on Monday they're going to have a marketing meeting. And that the marketing team, they're the ones who are going to say whether or not they're going to take it. And so just be prepared, they might not end up buying it. And so I'm kind of, over the weekend, bated breath, like, oh God, this could be awesome, it could be awful. And so it was an interesting weekend. And then on Monday, around sometime in midday, I get the email from my agent, they don't want it. The marketing team doesn't think they could sell it. And I'm like, deflated. Definitely deflated. I had kept writing, and I had a second manuscript that the agent shopped around, and then, then finally, we ended up parting ways, me and the agent, because there were 2 books went through, we just couldn't work. Yeah, it just didn't seem like it was ever going to work. So I went out on my own thinking, I'm going to get my own agent. Now I think I'm a pretty good writer. And I still haven't gotten another agent. So it's a really difficult process to go through. I'm feeling much better these days, but that was definitely my lowest.
I just parted ways with my agent.
It's a tough process. We could probably talk about that too, but maybe we'll leave that for the Q&A. Because it really is it is obviously a hugely important professional relationship, but it's one that sometimes it doesn't work. And I appreciated being in front of those, same with you, being in front of the editors, but if you're not going to be successful, then figure it out. I'm going to move on into that getting an agent publisher thread here. So we do live in an age where it's really easy to publish a book, in the sense that you can self-publish. All of us here are traditionally published, so we're not going to talk about that. But I do want to talk about the publishing experience, just in terms of that process that really every writer has to go through, whether it's they're getting an agent or whether they're shopping their manuscript to small presses or presses just generally. So I want to ask each of you, how you ended up with this book. Was it through an agent? Was it through pitching to small presses, or in your couple of cases here, university presses? Like how that ended up coming to be? And how long?
I think my agent submitted it to first all the usual suspects of, the ones, we start with the ones that can pay you and go from there. So that process took many months, and then she also, which might be interesting to some people to know, she was also willing to pitch independent publishers that are a little bit more well known, such as Grey Wolf, and Counterpoint. So she continued down that road, and then so there's like a stepping down, which does wonders for the ego. So like it's continuing. Okay, there's more, and then at some point she's like, I want to. She's a really great agent, and so she never kind of abandoned my book, even though I felt like, wow, you must have bills to pay. But like, she continued on. She's like, I'm willing to keep going, but at some point we're going to run out of places, because we had really gone everywhere. And she did say, there are some places that aren't so interested in agented manuscripts. Like they really want things from writers directly. And so, she was actually continuing, which doesn't always happen to have, lots of people where at that point their agent is like, well, we tried. But she was continuing to send to some smaller places, such as like Deep Vellum. There's a few other smaller independent presses that she could send agented submissions to. But then at that point, I started to look at places on my own, and that's when I found the University Press of Kentucky, which is the publisher, and sent it into them on my own. So they had like an annual call, and they have a series called First Poetry and Prose. So it's like a poetry book and a prose book every year in that series. And so I sent that in on my own. So when I heard the news that they wanted it, which was just a complete shock, at that point I could have just continued on my own because my agent had not actually submitted it. But she had spent almost 2 years, not to mention the year she had spent with me editing the book. I mean, there was no way that I was wanting to go on that journey without her. And so that's what I decided to do. So she still negotiated the contract for me, which I'm really glad she could do because it's pretty hard, and continues to be involved. But it is a very different process from other sort of more resource publishers, which I think we'll get to.
So Cornell University Press had an open submission period, and I sent them my short story collection, and I got a response back that said, well, we like this, but this isn't exactly what we're looking for. And I said, wait a minute, I have something else to show you. And I sent them this, and Jennifer said, I like it, but can you do this revision? We need this round of revisions. I said, sure, I could do that. And I think you said, I like it again after that, but we need another round of revision. And I said, sure, I can do that. And I did it. And then it went through the outside readers. There was like 4 plus
I think the
the
second revision was after the outside readers.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think it was before.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's okay. All right, it all worked out well. Then it went to the outside readers, and they all had suggestions, and Jennifer compiled them into like the ones that she felt were the most, worthwhile looking at. So it went through that round of revisions, and then after that, it was accepted. So it was a process. It definitely, took a while. I think it was like a couple of years of going through it.
It was about a year.
Was it?
Maybe
Maybe it just felt
like
but it worked out well. So
one of the things I will say that Kyle alluded to with his story is that when you're selling a manuscript to a publisher, whether it's you yourself or your agent, you're not just selling it to an editor. There's so many things you have to go through if you want to be published traditionally. You have to attract an agent. The agent has to attract an editor. The editor then has to sell it to their publishing house. They have what's called the acquisitions meeting, which is the dreaded meeting where they are selling it to marketing, to their other editorial people, to production. And so one of the things that was going on with this process with Angie was I had to, it was a fledgling fiction program, so I not only had to sell her book, but I sort of had to sell them on the program. So there was a lot that I had to do to be an advocate for Angie's book in the house so that I could get approval to go ahead and publish it. So it is a difficult process. It requires a very thick skin. What happened with me was I did get an agent. I ended up, after many, many rejections, finding an agent through, at the time it was on Twitter, a pitching party called #DVPitch, which was on hiatus for a while, is now coming back in October. It's an online pitching event for anyone who self-identifies as a somehow marginalized writer. And you don't have to prove anything, you don't have to show ID, you just jump in if you feel that you are in some way marginalized. Your book doesn't have to be about that identity. So for example, I identify as queer. My book happened to be a queer book, but it didn't have to be, as long as I identified that way. So that's coming back in October. So I found my agent that way. My agent then went through, I didn't know how lucky I was in a lot of respects, but on the first round, we found an editor who was interested. She wanted a little bit of revision before she was going to try to sell it to her press. So I did that revision, I sent it back to her, I'm waiting, and finally one day I'm like, what is going on? And I write to my agent, and he's like, and they said, I'm really sorry, I have news, it's not a deal, it's not an offer, but I'm trying to get more information, just sit tight. And I'm like, what? What is that? It turned out, long story short, what Algonquin offered me at that time was an option agreement. For those of you who are familiar with book contracts, usually there's an option clause in a book contract. When a publisher buys your book, there's usually a clause in the contract that says, we have the first right of refusal to the next full-length book you write in this genre. So it doesn't mean you have to publish with them, but you have to bring it to them first and before you bring it to anyone else, and allow them to say we want it or we don't want it. Well, they offered me that for this novel. They said, we want a very big revision. If you agree with what we're asking and you want to go ahead and make it, we're offering you this option agreement that says after the revision, you cannot bring it to anyone else. You have to bring it to us. We have first right of refusal. We will pay you a quarter of the advance that we will offer you if we're going to publish, just to do the revision. So we're going to pay you this lump sum of money to revise it, and if we take it, you get the rest of the advance. If we don't take it, you're free to bring it wherever you want, and you can keep the money, but if another press picks it up, you have to pay us back. And I was like, what on God's green earth is this? I have never heard of this. I started calling around to all my writer friends. I was like, is this a thing? Apparently it's a thing that Algonquin does. It's not done very much, but so I asked the important question of how many of these have you done, and how many of them have not resulted in an offer? What are my chances here if I go ahead and do this? So I went away, long story short. I thought for 24 hours about how I would revise this thing, and I made a promise to myself that if I wasn't going to be as happy or happier with the book after this revision, that I was going to walk away. I came up with an idea I loved. I ran it by my agent, I ran it by my editor, they both loved it. Voila. And then I was offered the contract from Algonquin, and they published my novel. But it was a wacky process, and I wish I had known that that was possible before I went in. That's why I tell that story.
That is wacky.
Yeah.
And mine was probably less wacky, much less wacky, in fact, much more traditional. As I mentioned before, I had the agent, and he shopped this book and another one, the Beowulf book, around. And once an agent has shopped the book to publishers, and you've gotten nothing from any of them, it's pretty much dead. You can't go to another agent and say, I have this book, and can you shop it around? It's pretty much done once all the publishers see it. So that's when I decided that I would make my break from the agent, because I really believed in this book. I thought it was the book that could finally do it, and I believed in it. So I decided I would try my own. And there are so many wonderful independent and small presses out there, and we're going to get to that in the next question, that it's not just the big five. It's not just the conglomerates that have the press by the, there's so many other ones. And so I actually had published this book is published by a small press called SFWP. And I had published that Simon Fruden's book, as I mentioned earlier, his collection, with this press. And they really loved it, that translation. And so I went to them and I said, and I actually submitted to the contest that I know you were also a finalist for. And it's a great small press, yes. And so I submitted to that contest, which, well, I submitted to that contest with a little note saying, you know, published this book before, and, you know, here's how my book ties into that translation that you loved. And so I didn't get a finalist, but I was longlisted. And the beautiful thing about SFWP is that they will still look at your book for publication, even if you do not win. And in my case, even if you're not even on the short list, I was just on the long list, which is like 50 titles. So, you know, long story short, I ended up publishing with them, and I felt really good about that. And it's been a good process. So there are so many, you know, good small presses. So I want to move into that here. What would you say? You know, you've published. I mean, Algonquin technically is now, is it under Hachette at this point, or?
Yeah, it's a part of Little Brown now.
So maybe it's the closest thing we have to a big press here. We got we got a small press, we've got university presses, and, you know, we have a big five, so to speak. But you guys, you work for your university press. So I'm really just kind of curious. Okay, let's talk about the difference between the three branches and your experience with the ones that you have, especially now with everything that's happening in this country, with everything that's happening in just books generally, the rise of AI and everything like that. What we're going to see, I mean, 5 years ago, I never would have thought we'd be where we're at now. And that goes for everything, pretty much. Where are we going? And particularly for writers and for folks who are out there writing their debut novel, hoping to get it published, where are we heading? This is a lot I'm giving you, actually. Let's start with the small press versus versus the university and the big five. Let's start with that first.
So I told you a little bit about how I got to my university press. From that, it's, you know, apparent that it wasn't my first choice. So, and I think now it's hard for me to say, like, you know, what I would do knowing what I know now about going through, because I definitely see so many advantages of this going this way, and also all of the things that are really challenging, especially when I, you know, look at other, like, I was in a cohort of, actually this is a good resource for folks, it's called Get the Word Out, and it's a program through the Poets and Writers magazine, and it's for debut writers. So if you have a contract, then you can apply for it, and you basically get 3 months with a publicist mentor, and you're part of a cohort of debut writers who are getting that advice. So it's a really wonderful resource, and I was just part of that for the first 3 months of this year. And because there were people in that from, you know, with all kinds of different publishers, I got to, and, you know, we were kind of really getting into the details and nitty gritty. I could see what the differences were and what a difference it made for them to be with a publisher that not only had a budget for some of the things that they can do, but what seemed to me more important was the contacts. So in terms of media contacts, like, that was, because my university press, the advantage that I've seen compared to some of the other folks is, like, I could really see that the team that I have there is really dedicated, and they always reply to my emails really quickly. I mean, I don't know if that's always the case but that's been my experience. And they're really engaged, and, you know, if I'm engaged, then they're engaged, you know, like, so. And I don't think I've seen that so much with some of the other folks that I've gotten to know. And, you know, they don't get their emails returned because they're just, you know, one more, you know, writer in a bigger constellation. So I've seen all of that. But then there's this other aspect that kind of speaks to a little of what you were saying just now at this moment here, is that that I feel like with the university press, there's a values alignment there that I hadn't really considered when I first entered, you know, trying to get a publisher. That, you know, what else is my university press publishing, and how do I feel about being part of that? I really like being part of that, and I really like the books that they're publishing. You know, since my publisher is in Appalachia, they publish a lot of Appalachian writers and people who would not get published by anyone else. And, you know, they just had an anthology come out by queer Appalachian writers, queer and trans Appalachian writers. So, who else is publishing that? Not the big five, right? And who else is publishing me? Not the big five. So it's not a coincidence, that, and I actually just wrote, because I have all the receipts from all the, awful BS racist stuff that publishers said to me, and I put them all in an essay that's in Poets and Writers right now. So if you want to know more, it's in there. But, because of all of those experiences, now, I don't know what I would do with the next book, but it is making me ask a lot of questions about what I'm willing to sign up for.
Okay, so before I went to graduate school, I was a marketing communications executive in New York City for 10 years. So I don't have the same discomfort that a lot of writers have with marketing their work, right? So I knew when I was going to be published by Cornell that we're looking at a university press that I don't know how big their marketing team is. I know they have other books that they're putting out. So, they don't have the type of time potentially and staff to be like, oh, let's really just focus on Angie's book, right? And they also potentially, because it's so hard to get reviews even for trade publishers, let alone indie presses, university presses, I knew that it was going to be challenging on all fronts. So even before I ever met with the marketing team at Cornell, I was like, I'm going to learn about book marketing. I knew about, nonprofit marketing. Let's turn my attention to this. So I spent a year learning everything I could about book marketing, the different, reviewers that were out there, the podcasts that were out there, the radio shows, the, anything you could think of, the whole plan, a whole timeline. I put together a document like you wouldn't believe. So then when I got to the point of actually meeting with the marketing team, I could say to them, I'd love to be able to help as much as I can, because I don't know how much you have on your plates already, but let me help as much as I possibly can. And they literally handed over the document to them. They were super wonderful to work with, super receptive. Literally what you said just rang so true with me. If I sent an email saying, hey, can we pitch, can you send a copy of the book to these people? Sure, done, right? Immediate response. So that was fantastic. If I said, hey, can we submit my book to a contest that there's no chance in hell I'm going to win? Sure, we can do that. And I was like, yay, awesome. They were just wonderful in that way. But it really took a lot of work on my part too to learn so that I could help as much as I possibly could and could look for other opportunities that were out there that, I could pass on that they probably knew of already, but at least I could be like, hey, what about this? So I recommend that as a process when you're working with an indie press, because they don't have the same marketing team as a big trade publisher. And even if they did have that, there's no guarantee that you're going to get the reviews that really can get a book out there. So that effort, I think, helps with getting a good amount of publicity in combination with all the hard work that the Cornell marketing team put into it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had an experience. I had written a novel before Endpapers, and I did not get an agent. I did not get it picked up by a small press. And so I didn't have any luck with either of those routes. And so with Endpapers, when it went to Algonquin, I was just thrilled. I had wanted something in between the big five and a tiny little press, like a Grey Wolf kind of, and Algonquin was that when I first signed with them. And within a few months, they were bought by Hachette, and everything changed. Everything changed. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, but it was drastic. I went from having very close relationships. I had an editor who edited very closely with me, to the point where if she was out on the street walking and she saw something that reminded her of my book, she would text me. I mean, I really felt like I had a partner in the editing process. I had very close relationships with everybody on the team, and as soon as it got bought by Hachette, it became, I just felt so much more like a commodity, and because my book wasn't selling like hotcakes, I was not a priority for them anymore. And so on the one hand, they had a lot more resources, and they were leading a lot of the effort with the publicity and the marketing, and I got some really wonderful things as a result that happened. That I think small presses are not as able to do for a writer. So either way, I do think there's a trade-off. I don't think that one is better than the other, if I'm being honest. I think that there are just pluses and minuses to both. And I have become over the years a big advocate for getting your work out in whatever way feels good to you and whatever way feels like it will sort of help you reach your goals as an author. If that's self-publishing, great. Learn everything you can, talk to other people who do it. It's not easy. It's not any easier, I don't think, than going the traditional route. It's more guaranteed, but guaranteed and easier are very different. If you're interested in small presses, just educate yourself. I do think that writers can get their work out. However, they, if that's your goal, just to get it out and have readers, there are always ways to do it. And there are just pluses and minuses to all of it. Yeah. And I guess the last thing I would say is, look at things like, are your readers, are you going to find the readers that for your work, like have a sense of who your readers are, and try to target the places where you think you're really going to find your readers. Because, for example, my editor sent a book out to Grey Wolf that my agent, that I knew was not a Grey Wolf book in my heart, but I let her do it because I thought, well, she's an agent, maybe she knows better. But I could have written the rejection letter that came with it, It really was just a waste of everyone's time. So anyway, that's my response to that. Is there anything more that you wanted from me because I work at CUP? I feel like they really covered university presses.
I think so too, and that's fine. And in fact, we're bumping up against the hour here. We're at 6:20, and I have more questions, and in particular on promoting the work before the book comes out, like what you have to do, all the steps. But I wanted to say, if somebody wants to ask a question, and if there are a bunch of questions, I don't want to neglect the question. So would you rather have your questions, or would you rather we talk about how to promote your book before it comes out? Because I think we all have a lot to say on that. That one, okay. All right, so once you land a book contract, once you're in the pipeline for getting a book out, you've got a lot of work to do, because that's really when it begins. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into publishing a book or getting it written, but then you discover that, holy shit, you've got a lot to do. So I want to ask each of you what kind of steps you took before your book came out that made sure that at the very least you would have your name out there, the book out there, so that readers would know it exists.
So I think that when we first spoke, when you wrote an article in the Millions about what smaller press or university press authors are looking for, or defining rather, as success, right? That was the article. Great piece that Kyle wrote. I recommend everyone looking it up. So that was a little earlier in my process, so that kind of got me thinking about what am I actually looking for in this process, and who do I want to reach? And then using that to kind of think about what I want to do for promotion. And I knew that I wanted to reach communities that I care about, other immigrants, other outside women, as I call them, women who have been pushed outside of the institutions of power, people that I had taught in workshops, people who I had organized with, all of that. So when I started thinking about that, the first thing that made sense to do was start reaching out to everybody. So I spent a lot of time last summer reaching out to everybody, and I don't mean sending a mass email. I mean just scheduling chats with people. And actually that's how I met Kyle, because I had reached out to a friend who is a mutual friend of ours, and she said, and she's with Kyle. So things kind of snowball from there usually, and that happened over and over again. So my biggest takeaway from this process, and there are lots of other things that I did, but this is the biggest takeaway, was that the people who get you through everything else are the people who are going to get you through this. It's actually not, I thought I want to, have all this recognition from other, writers or industry or whatever, but as actually all the people who have been there for other things. And what's interesting right now, especially because it's such a gloomy time, just to put it mildly, is that people seem really glad to have something positive to support. And I mean, how many times do you get to spend a few dollars and actually support somebody's dream? So people are really responding in that way, which was kind of beautiful to see that. So I feel that is really just reconnecting with networks. They don't have to be writers, ideally readers, but not even necessarily, and just giving them stuff to do, and things happen from there.
Yeah, that's definitely great advice, like make those connections with people and start early. For me, it was also working on my social media platform from years ago, right? Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever. So that I could have a consistent sort of presence on that stuff, so that when it became time for posting stuff about my book, it was a mix. It was never like, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book. That is boring and repetitive. So it would be like, here's my cat, now buy my book. Here's my chickens, now buy my book. Like, so I have a nice variety of stuff across the board with social media. I'm also a planner because of my background. So Excel document with media contacts organized according to whether they're podcasters or writers or whatever. A document that was my marketing plan, and starting to fill in, like, doing the research to figure out where are the bookstores nearby that would be interested in doing an event with me. Finding out some of the people that do salons, book salons, and connecting with them. There are so many social media opportunities, like the Binders on Facebook. This is a women's organization of various groups that promote women's writing, participating in that. Like, just so many different things that you can do, but a lot of it was also just learning what opportunities were out there, learning about book marketing, and then just taking notes and keeping track of everything. That helped me in getting more of the word out and just being consistent.
Yeah, I was very ignorant of a lot of book publicity stuff when my novel was coming out, and I ended up, with Algonquin, I did have a publicist at Algonquin, and she lined up a lot of things for me. And so what ended up happening was, I felt like once my book came out, I was just scrambling to keep up with all the things that they were sending my way. Deadline after deadline, whether it was an interview or an essay they wanted me to write, or or whatever it was, they were sort of doing it for me. And I think I was just so overwhelmed that, as much as I am grateful, and as I said, a lot of great things came of that, I didn't really, it made me kind of give over the process in a way that I, looking back, I sort of wish that I had prepared myself more for, because even though it's great to have a publicist doing all this stuff, for example, my book was marketed very heavily and promoted very heavily as a queer book, which it 100% is. It is also very much a book about art. It is very much a book about the sort of differences and similarities between post 9/11, New York City and 1950s New York City during the Lavender Scare. So there were a lot of things that I felt like sort of got overlooked in the marketing and publicity of my book that I, looking back, sort of wish that I had had the energy to focus on. That, and also just certain goals that I have for myself, and some of them are sort of like the train has already left and it's too late, and other ones that I feel like I can still do. Like, I'm really interested in teaching workshops, for example, virtually or at conferences, and that's something that I feel like I can still do now. But when it comes to like specific publicity or marketing for your book, you really have a short window where people are going to respond to you and to things that you might be interested in. So again, I just wish that I had prepared more myself, so I wasn't so overwhelmed by Algonquin's plan for the book. But again, it's a small thing in hindsight, but if that's something that you care about, a lot of people said, think about this way in advance, but like when you're writing, you don't ever believe you're going to get published. And so there was part of me that was like, I'm too superstitious to do that. But the truth is, it's good to think about before you're there.
And we're going to wrap up. I see you, Robin. We're going to wrap up. There's another event coming in. I did want to say one thing, though, and for those who are with a small press and there's no marketing team, one of the things that the authors need to do is get comfortable pitching stories and pitching ideas. I will say and end on this, and we'll all be available. There are books for sale in the back. We'll all be available for questions and signing if you want to purchase the book. But the one thing that I did that has been the most successful was I pitched Huffington Post on a story that was related to the book. And that got 700,000 views and counting. It's one of their biggest ones from 2024. And it was on the strength of that it was picked up for audio sales. So a major audiobook distributor bought it and made an audiobook on the strength of that one essay. So that is a huge thing for writers to think about. That beyond what the publisher can do, each individual author has agency to do that kind of thing and to make the book fly even farther. Anyway, at that, thank you all for coming.